August 17, 1945. Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. ****. The morning air hung thick with the scent of iodine and salt water. In a makeshift field hospital erected beneath canvas tarps stretched taut against bamboo frames, 37 Japanese nurses stood in rigid formation, their white uniforms stained with the rust-colored residue of weeks spent treating wounded civilians without adequate supplies. The war had ended 2 days prior, yet the echo of it lingered in every labored breath, every suppurating wound, every child's cry that went unanswered in the overcrowded wards. Outside, the sounds of American jeeps rumbled closer, their engines growling like mechanical beasts approaching through the rubble-strewn streets of what had once been Naha. Nurse Fumiko Tanaka, 23 years old, felt her hands trembling despite the rigid discipline drilled into her since nursing school. She had been taught that surrender meant dishonor. She had been taught that the Americans were demons. Now those demons were about to walk through the tent flaps, and she could only think of the surgical scissors tucked into her waistband, not for defense, but for the possibility that death by one's own hand might still preserve dignity. When the canvas flap lifted, what entered was not the monster of propaganda posters. Lieutenant Commander James Whitmore of the United States Navy Medical Corps stepped inside, removing his cap as he did so, a gesture Fumiko had seen Japanese officers make in the presence of the Emperor's portrait. He was tall, with the sun-weathered face of someone who had spent months at sea, and his eyes moved quickly across the rows of wounded on straw mats, across the nurses standing at attention, across the surgical tools laid out on a plank of wood that served as an operating table. He did not shout. He did not sneer. Instead, he turned to his translator, a Japanese-American corpsman named Sato, and spoke in measured tones that carried an unfamiliar quality, concern. "Ask them how long they've been without fresh dressings," Whitmore said. The question, when translated, hung in the humid air like something foreign and incomprehensible. The nurses exchanged glances. Why would an enemy commander care about dressings? Fumiko, as the senior nurse present, stepped forward 1 pace and bowed, 30 degrees, the appropriate angle for addressing a military superior, even one who wore the uniform of the enemy. 12 days, sir," she replied in halting English learned from textbooks that had depicted Americans as culturally inferior. "We use boiled cloth now. We boil many times." What happened next would remain etched in Fumiko Tanaka's memory with the clarity of photographs developed in chemical baths, the American doctor's face registering not satisfaction at Japan's suffering, not contempt for their primitive conditions, but something that translated poorly into the ideology she had been fed for years, genuine distress. 12 days, Whitmore repeated, and then he did something unprecedented. He turned fully toward the nurses, brought his heels together in a gesture of formal respect, and spoke words that corpsman Sato translated with visible uncertainty, as if unsure he had heard correctly. "On behalf of the United States Navy Medical Corps, I apologize for not arriving sooner. We should have been here to help you days ago." An apology. From a conqueror to the conquered. For a delay in providing aid. The concept shattered against the architecture of everything Fumiko had been taught about warfare, about honor, about the fundamental nature of victor and vanquished. In the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Service, delays were accepted with stoic silence. Complaints indicated weakness. Suffering was a refining fire. The notion that a superior officer, let alone an enemy officer, would acknowledge failure in providing timely care to subordinates, and to enemy subordinates at that, existed nowhere in her understanding of military hierarchy. Whitmore was already in motion, his team of Navy corpsmen flowing into the hospital space with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. They carried crates marked with red crosses, supplies that seemed impossibly abundant, sealed packages of gauze, bottles of sulfa powder, morphine syrettes in their distinctive tubes, plasma bottles that gleamed like liquid amber in the filtered sunlight. One corpsman began setting up a field sterilization unit. Another started inventorying the medical supplies the Japanese nurses had been using, his face growing increasingly somber as he examined the reboiled rags, the surgical instruments sharpened so many times they had become dangerously thin, the single thermometer shared among dozens of patients. "We'll need to establish a proper sanitation protocol," Whitmore said, speaking to Sato but ensuring his voice carried to the Japanese nurses. "And I want these women to understand, they are not prisoners. They are medical personnel, and under the Geneva Convention, they are to be treated as colleagues." Colleagues. Another word that fit poorly into the expected framework. To understand the depth of shock that rippled through that field hospital requires stepping backward through the architecture of ideology that had shaped these Japanese nurses. They had been trained in a medical system that blended Western surgical technique with Confucian concepts of hierarchy and duty. In the Bushido-influenced military culture of wartime Japan, the relationship between superior and subordinate was absolute. Orders flowed downward, obedience flowed upward. The concept of a superior apologizing to a subordinate inverted the fundamental order of society. It suggested equality where there should be rank. It implied that the suffering of subordinates mattered to those who gave commands. More than this, it contradicted everything the imperial propaganda machine had constructed about American character. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese civilians and soldiers had been fed a steady diet of images portraying Americans as materialistic barbarians, culturally bankrupt beings who valued individual comfort over collective duty, who would crumble when faced with Japan's spiritual superiority. The propaganda films showed Americans as soft, cowardly, motivated only by base desires. The educational pamphlets distributed to medical personnel had warned of American cruelty toward prisoners, of torture and humiliation awaiting those who fell into enemy hands. Surrender, they had been told repeatedly, was a fate worse than death. Fumiko and her fellow nurses had internalized these messages through 4 years of total war. They had treated wounded soldiers who spoke of the enemy with a mixture of contempt and fear, contempt for American weakness, fear of American savagery. They had seen their own military's harsh discipline, officers striking enlisted men, medics expected to continue working through exhaustion unto collapse, the sick shamed for imposing burdens on their units. In this context, suffering was evidence of dedication. Complaint was betrayal. The suggestion that those in command bore responsibility for the welfare of those beneath them existed only in the abstract language of official doctrine, never in lived practice. And yet here was Lieutenant Commander Whitmore, kneeling beside a wounded Okinawan woman, his hands gentle as he examined a gangrenous leg wound, his voice soft as he explained through the translator what he intended to do, asking permission before touching her. Asking permission from a civilian of a defeated enemy nation. The woman, elderly and delirious with fever, could not have understood the significance of the question. But Fumiko understood. She understood that this represented a philosophical chasm between what she had been taught and what she was witnessing. The American medical team worked with a casual efficiency that itself became educational. They did not move with the rigid formality of Japanese military personnel, yet their work was no less professional. They joked quietly among themselves while changing dressings, their humor gentle rather than crude, its purpose clearly to ease tension rather than to demean. When a young corpsman made an error in setting up an 4-line, Whitmore corrected him with firm instruction but without shouting, without striking, without public humiliation. The correction was followed immediately by explanation. You want to check the drip rate because if it flows too fast with her dehydration level, we risk circulatory overload. Understand? Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Don't apologize to me. Do it right for her. This exchange, observed by multiple Japanese nurses, carried implications that rippled outward like concentric circles on disturbed water. The acknowledgement of error without shame. The correction without humiliation. The redirection of responsibility toward the patient rather than toward the hierarchy. These were not the methods of the military medical system in which they had been trained. By the third day of American occupation of the field hospital, the initial shock had begun to metabolize into something more complex, a kind of cognitive dissonance that Fumiko felt as physical discomfort, like a bone set incorrectly that must be broken again to heal properly. The Americans had transformed the facility with startling speed. Proper surgical lighting had been rigged. A generator hummed in the background, providing electricity for sterilization equipment. The wounded had been re-triaged, their dressings changed with materials that did not need to be boiled and reused. Medications had been distributed with a liberality that seemed almost careless. Bottles of pills left with nurses, morphine dispensed for pain relief rather than reserved only for the most extreme cases. It was the abundance that proved most disorienting. In the imperial military medical system, scarcity had been a constant companion. Supplies were rationed with meticulous care. Medications were reserved for those deemed most likely to survive and return to duty. The calculus was always utilitarian, always focused on preserving combat effectiveness rather than alleviating suffering. Pain was considered a test of character. Patients who complained were weak. Nurses who showed excessive sympathy were insufficiently disciplined. The Americans operated under a different calculus entirely. Fumiko watched as a corpsman spent 20 minutes adjusting a splint on a civilian boy's broken arm, not because the original splint was failing, but because the boy had mentioned it was uncomfortable. 20 minutes of a trained medic's time, for comfort rather than mere function. The boy received a lollipop afterward, a luxury item, sugar wrapped in colored paper, given freely to a child of the enemy nation. The gesture was so casual that the corpsman clearly gave it no thought, simply reached into his pocket and produced the candy as automatically as a reflex. "Why does he do this?" Fumiko asked Corpsman Sato, who had become an informal liaison between the American medical team and the Japanese nurses. Sato, a Nisei whose parents had immigrated to California before the war, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Do what specifically?" "The candy. All of it. The time spent for comfort. The apology from your commander. The supplies used so freely. We are your enemy." Sato looked at her with an expression that mixed sympathy with something like sadness. "No," he said quietly. "The war is your enemy. You're a nurse. That boy is a patient. In American military medicine, we're taught that suffering is the enemy, not the person who suffers." The statement was so foreign to her training that Fumiko initially assumed something had been lost in translation. But Sato's Japanese was flawless, and he did not seem to be speaking in metaphor. He meant it literally. Suffering itself was the adversary to be fought, regardless of which uniform the sufferer wore. This philosophy manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into a portrait of a fundamentally different worldview. When supplies arrived, they were not locked away under guard but placed in open storage where nurses could access them as needed. When Fumiko hesitated before using a full packet of sulfa powder on a minor infection, Corpsman Sato noticed and brought her an entire case of the packets. "Use what you need," he said. "We have more coming tomorrow." "But what if tomorrow the supplies do not come?" "Then we'll request them, and they'll come the day after. The supply chain is solid. You don't need to ration like that anymore." The concept of a reliable, abundant supply chain existing in the aftermath of total war seemed fantastical. Japan's supply lines had collapsed progressively throughout the conflict, leaving military units and medical facilities to make do with ever-diminishing resources. The idea that an army could wage war while simultaneously ensuring that medical supplies flowed continuously to the point of surplus contradicted everything Fumiko had experienced. Yet here was the evidence, crate after crate arriving on trucks that themselves seemed impossibly numerous. The abundance extended beyond material goods into the realm of time and attention. On the fifth day, Lieutenant Commander Whitmore organized a training session. He gathered the Japanese nurses in the largest tent and, through corpsman Sato, conducted a lecture on the latest American techniques in wound care and infection prevention. He used charts prepared on clean white paper, diagrams that illustrated the principles of debridement and drainage. He asked questions to ensure comprehension. He encouraged the nurses to ask their own questions and responded to each with patient thoroughness. At one point, a young nurse named Keiko raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir, is it true that American nurses are permitted to make medical decisions without a doctor's direct orders?" Whitmore nodded. "For certain procedures, yes. We use protocols, standardized treatment guidelines that nurses can implement based on their assessment of the situation. A good nurse's judgment is valuable, and in combat medicine, waiting for a doctor's orders can mean the difference between life and death." The concept hung in the air, radical and strange. In the Japanese system, nurses followed orders with precise obedience. Initiative was not encouraged. Deviation from protocols established by physicians could result in severe punishment. The suggestion that nurses could be trusted to make independent medical judgments implied a respect for their expertise that contradicted the rigid hierarchy in which they had been trained. But what if the nurse makes a mistake? Keiko pressed. "What is the punishment?" Whitmore glanced at Sato, who translated carefully. The American doctor considered his response before speaking. If a nurse makes a mistake in good faith, using her best judgment based on proper training, it's not punished, it's a learning opportunity. We review what went wrong, understand why, and improve the protocol if needed. Now, if someone is negligent or acts outside their training deliberately, that's different. But honest mistakes made while trying to help a patient? Those are part of learning medicine. Fumiko felt the words rearranging something fundamental in her understanding. Mistakes as learning opportunities rather than failures requiring punishment. Judgment trusted rather than demanded. The implications spread like fractures through ice. Over the following days, she observed this philosophy in practice. A young American corpsman miscalculated a drug dosage, catching his error before administration but clearly shaken by the close call. Whitmore pulled him aside, and Fumiko, nearby, could hear the exchange. "Walk me through your calculation," Whitmore said. The corpsman did, his voice uncertain. Whitmore identified the error, a confusion between milligrams and milliliters, and then spent 10 minutes explaining the correct method, using examples, ensuring understanding. No shouting. No striking. No public humiliation before peers. At the end, Whitmore simply said, "You caught it, which means your safety check worked. But let's tighten up that mental math. Next time, double-check your units before you draw anything up." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." "Thank you for being careful." Dismissed. Fumiko found herself contrasting this with her own training, where errors had been met with harsh punishment regardless of intent or outcome. She remembered a classmate struck across the face for dropping a tray of instruments during a surgery. She remembered a nurse dismissed from service for questioning a doctor's order that had seemed incorrect. The emphasis had always been on obedience, never on understanding, on perfection, never on growth. The symbolic weight of the American apology and the philosophy it represented crystallized around a specific recurring element: the ration boxes that arrived daily for the medical personnel. These were not combat rations but food service supplies meant for hospital staff: canned goods, dried fruits, chocolate bars, coffee, sugar. To the Japanese nurses, who had been subsisting on rice gruel and pickled vegetables for weeks, the abundance seemed obscene. Each evening, the American personnel would open the ration supplies and share them communally. What startled Fumiko was not simply the quantity, though that was impressive, but the casualness with which it was treated. Food was not hoarded. It was offered freely, even to the Japanese nurses who had initially refused out of pride or suspicion. Corpsman Sato would bring over cans of peaches, packets of crackers, chocolate bars wrapped in olive drab paper. "You need to eat properly if you're going to work these shifts," he would say, leaving the food on the table and walking away, removing the obligation of face-to-face acceptance. Fumiko initially refused, her pride insisting that accepting food from the enemy was shameful. But watching her younger nurses growing thin, seeing their hands shake with fatigue and malnutrition, she eventually relented. The first bite of chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz wartime substitute made from soybeans, tasted like a confession of defeat. It was sweet to the point of overwhelming, rich with fats and sugar that her body craved desperately. She ate it slowly, in small pieces, feeling as though she were consuming something illicit. The chocolate became a recurring symbol in her internal narrative of this strange period. Each time she accepted a piece, she felt the ideology of her training eroding slightly, like water wearing at stone. The propaganda had insisted that Americans were soft because of their materialism, that their love of comfort and abundance made them spiritually weak. But here was abundance placed in the service of care, material wealth used to sustain those who sustained others. The chocolate was not kept for American lips alone. It was shared freely, even with those who had been, days earlier, enemies. She watched as Lieutenant Commander Whitmore rationed his own supplies, not because of scarcity, but to ensure that his corpsmen ate first. She observed him giving his coffee to an exhausted Japanese nurse during a long surgery, insisting through Sato that she needed the stimulant more than he did. These actions contradicted the portrait of American selfishness that had been drawn by propagandists. The abundance was not hoarded, it was circulated, used as a tool for maintaining effectiveness and morale. One evening, as Fumiko shared a can of pineapple with Keiko and another nurse, Keiko asked the question that had been forming in all their minds: how can they have so much? How can a nation at war, fighting on two fronts across two oceans, still have enough to give away chocolate and canned fruit? Fumiko had no answer that satisfied. The mathematics seemed impossible. Japan had struggled to supply its military even when the war was going well, even when conquest brought resources. The American abundance suggested an industrial capacity so vast that it could wage total war while maintaining luxuries for its troops. It implied a supply chain efficient enough to deliver peaches to a field hospital on a destroyed island thousands of miles from home. It hinted at a society wealthy enough that sugar and chocolate and coffee were not precious rarities but everyday items considered necessary for morale. The material abundance was, Fumiko began to understand, not separate from the American military philosophy but intrinsic to it. A society that valued individual life highly would invest in keeping its soldiers healthy, fed, content. A military that trusted its subordinates would ensure they had the resources to make good decisions. The chocolate was not incidental. It was evidence of a completely different relationship between state and soldier, between command and execution. The transformation in understanding accelerated during a crisis. 2 weeks after the American arrival, a group of wounded Japanese soldiers was brought to the hospital. Men who had been hiding in the hills, unaware that the war had ended, surviving on foraged food and slowly dying of untreated wounds. They arrived emaciated, delirious, some barely conscious. Their uniforms were rotted rags. Their weapons had been taken by the Okinawan civilians who had convinced them to seek medical care. Fumiko watched as these men were carried into the hospital, wondering what the Americans would do. These were enemy combatants, men who had perhaps killed American soldiers. In the Japanese military system, such men, if captured, would face interrogation, potential torture, imprisonment under brutal conditions. At best, they would be treated with the minimum care necessary to keep them alive for intelligence purposes. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore was in surgery when the soldiers arrived. The senior corpsman on duty, a Texan named Donnelly, began immediate triage. He moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency, assessing injuries, calling out orders to the other corpsmen. When he reached a soldier with a chest wound that had festered into a massive infection, he called for plasma and antibiotics without hesitation. One of the Japanese soldiers, less injured than the others and still conscious, began shouting. Fumiko moved closer to translate. The soldier was refusing treatment, insisting with feverish intensity that he would not accept help from the enemy, that accepting American medical care was dishonorable. Corpsman Donnelly, who spoke no Japanese, looked to Fumiko for translation.